to give you another military history presentation as Carleton County's military specialist. Tonight is the next presentation on the World War II timeline, the Japanese invasion of Malaya. Joint warfighting doctrine has continued to evolve since the Second World War, and most recently has become an issue of substantial focus and development within the U.S. military. Today, it is recognized that the significance of joint warfighting is its potential for overwhelming effect in today's terms, the means by which the full measure of U.S. military power can be brought to bear effectively in any crisis. In fully understanding the concept of joint warfighting, the first question to ask is what makes joint warfighting joint? The formal answer is found in current doctrine that says that joint warfighting exists when it evolves forces of two or more service departments. They are effective when the unique strengths and advantages of their forces are successfully integrated and focused. It works better than a non-joint approach, which can be proved through historical analysis. A number of historical examples can illustrate and reinforce the efficacy of joint warfighting. One such example is the Japanese campaign against British Commonwealth forces in Malaya during the Second World War. During that campaign, the Japanese applied the tenets of joint warfare doctrine in defeating the British. So this is going to be the Japanese invasion of Malaya. So this is the next presentation of the World War II timeline. I'm Aaron Boma, military specialist for Carleton County. The Japanese planned on invading north of Malaya from three key points, so they needed to make use of the ports, airfields, and railways in Thailand to get to the two other points. And we talked about Thailand. Since Kota was easy for them to reach, so they needed to get on the Thai military's good side, because if not, their invasion would be delayed and they would lose their element of surprise. At the time, Thailand was still involved in small battles with France because they were trying to take back the provinces that they lost during the Franco-Siamese War. Since the Japanese really needed to make use of Taiwan's resources, they acted as negotiators between Thai and French to bring about a settlement. Meanwhile, as the negotiations were ongoing, there were secret discussions going on behind closed doors between the Japanese and the Thai Prime Minister at the time, Phobin Sokrem, where the Japanese military asked him for free passage through Thailand, so that when the time came for them to invade, they wouldn't have any obstacles delaying them. The Thai military still prepared themselves just in case a clash happened. The Thai Prime Minister knew the Japanese were well armed, but he wasn't certain that the Japanese would win against the British and the Americans. That's why he didn't commit Thailand wholly to Japan. With Thailand now kinda on their side, all they needed was a way to get around. So they stole bikes that had originally been imported from Japan. Songkram wanted Thailand to be on the winning side of the war, regardless of whose side they were on, which was why on the 8th of December, just after 1 a.m., when the Japanese came by ship and landed on Signora and Patani, there were no attacks on them, unlike Kota Baru. And there'll be more on this later. And this is some of the stuff I touched on definitely with the invasion of Thailand, the last presentation. By mid-morning, the Japanese had 60 military aircrafts on the ground at the Signora airfield. Since the Thais weren't giving the Japanese much resistance, it allowed them to roll their way through Malaya in a bicycle infantry. The Japanese couldn't bring bicycles because they would take ages to get off the sandy beaches. But they knew that Malaya had many bicycles to commandeer because they were imported from Japan. Bicycles allowed the element of surprise and also used to confuse the soldiers defending Malaya. They also knew that it would be much quieter and faster to travel in them. And because Malaya at the time had good hard surface roads, it was quite easy for the Japanese soldiers to ride on. Even the British soldiers couldn't stop them because they were really fast. Of course, most of the time they were overtaken by the Japanese soldiers on their bicycles, um, driven off the paved roads into the jungle, and then forced them to surrender. Analytical method in conducting a historical campaign analysis to demonstrate how joint warfighting doctrine was applied. The word joint must first be defined in more conceptual, universally applicable terms than in the current service department based doctrine. Each of the service departments can be thought of as a dimensional expert, and the competencies of their respective forces can be considered dimension based. The dimensions are defined by operating medium, air, land, or sea. Forces designed to operate in a particular dimension inherit the natural strengths and advantages attendant thereto. And so, conceptually, joint warfighting is the merging of two, three, or more dimensional competencies into a harmonious, unified effort. Put another way, it is the application of integrated, multidimensional military power. The intended result is synergized force that has overwhelming effect, achieved by an all aspect capability that allows force application at great depth and provides for the availability of an asymmetric advantage at any point of contention. Here's some of the Japanese soldiers coming through in Malaya. These are light infantry. Um, Much like the Danish on April 9th, 1940, a lot of their infantry were mobile, light infantry units that were going by bicycle, and they didn't have much anti-armor capability. And it was very quickly over. Then the Germans when the Germans had invaded, it just took a few days, and it was over pretty much. And so you can see here, this is used by the enemy this time. Malaya doesn't have, I mean, the if the British and the French are going to be pushed back in other areas close to there, the Japanese also have heavy armor as well as artillery coming in. And these guys here, Malaya is going to be easy to take if there's not much resistance. But we'll keep going here. Defining joint warfighting as a multidimensional endeavor, the analytical framework constructed from current joint doctrine and analysis analyzes the Japanese campaign relative to the fundamental elements of operational art. This approach, like current doctrine, emphasizes the operational level nature of joint warfighting, granting that effective joint warfighting implicitly demands adherence to these fundamental elements. The Japanese adhered to the fundamental elements, and the collective result was embedded in the overarching joint warfighting characteristic, applied multidimensional force, a force that was manifested by the effective integration of Japanese air, land, and naval power. So the invasion of Malaya, alongside with the invasion of the Philippines, the invasion of and the taking of territory all along Southeast Asia, it started the day of or the day after um, the attack on Pearl Harbor, and it was just right hours afterward they launched attacks. So Thailand, Malaya, Philippines, and I've talked about those, and from December 8th, 1941 to January 25th, 1942. Um, and the British were overwhelmed, and of course, the British were overwhelmed. Malaya Command, under the British, it was pretty much given that they didn't have enough of a foothold on Malaya to hold it. When Singora was taken December 8th, and then those airfields, they continued onward from December 11th to 13th to Chitra up here. Um, um, Star, December 14th, 15th. Also, they attack here, go to Abaru, and that's December 8th. The 12th, the 25th Army, Yamashita's army, had attacked in two different places and come down. Um, they had come down and pushed through relatively fast. December 17th and 16th, taking Georgetown. December 19th, Kuakrai, and and finally, Kua Dangster sorry, King Sar, Kuo King Sar, sorry, Apoch, Kampar, and early January they've taken over half of the island, and by January 25th, Johor, the bottom half of the um, island had been taken, and then next, of course, is the invasion of Singapore, and so that they're going to keep pushing and keep pushing. It takes Sumatra, Singapore, so those are areas that they're all going to be um, next on the timeline for the Japanese to have in their gun sights. In December 1941, the Japanese began their war efforts to secure and dominate the entire Far East. It was the first phase of a three-phase strategy ultimately aimed at placing the Japanese in control of the southern regions, which included the resource-rich Netherlands East Indies. Their strategy was to simultaneously conduct multiple operations throughout the region in an effort to surprise and confuse the Allies as to their objectives. Once the Japanese objectives had been achieved, they would begin consolidating and strengthening them in an effort to create an impenetrable strategic defense intended to fend off the expected counterattack by Allied forces. The assumption was that the Allies, operating at the end of long supply lines and without any advanced bases, would be unable to sustain an effort against their defense, ultimately relenting for the Japanese, leaving them hegemony of the Far East under the guise of their Greater East Asia prosperity sphere. The Japanese began with the destruction of the American fleet in Pearl Harbor, of course, for it represented the most serious threat to interdict their operations in the region. At the same time, they launched attacks and campaigns throughout the southern region, including a two-pronged thrust against the Philippines and Malaya. The ultimate goal of the Malay campaign was the seizure of Singapore, which would ensure unhindered movement of oil from the Netherlands East Indies to Japan, while eliminating what had been to that point the symbol of British power in the Far East. The campaign lasted over 2 months, beginning in early December 1941 and ending with the British surrender at Singapore on February 15th, 1942. The Japanese achieved their victory despite having to project power from sea to land and then being on the attack with an outnumbered ground force against a defending enemy over difficult terrain. In a demanding tropical climate, the Japanese victory was assured in large measure because they effectively integrated the combined capabilities of their air, land, and naval forces. As military historian John Keegan noted, the perimeter strategy was rooted deeply in the psyche and history of the Japanese, who, as an island people, had long been accustomed to using land and sea forces in concert to preserve the security of the archipelago they inhabit and extend national power into adjoining regions. Commanders of joint forces should arrange the element of the campaign in space and time to exploit an adversary's vulnerabilities while taking advantage of friendly capabilities. This is commonly accomplished by the use of both sequential and simultaneous actions aimed at achieving campaign objectives rapidly. And that's what the Japanese certainly attempted to do. Campaigns are typically structured in phases. The Japanese had a clearly outlined campaign plan finalized by the end of October 1941, of which the Malayan operation was just one part. Phase 1 would begin with the attack on Pearl Harbor to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet, followed almost immediately by landings on the Kra Isthmus in Thailand and in northern Malaya in preparation for a push south to Singapore. Also in Phase 1 were to be the invasion of Hong Kong, air attacks on Guam, Wake, and Luzon to cut U.S. communications, followed by the invasions of Mindanao, and Luzon, and the seizure of Borneo's oil fields. All of this was scheduled for completion by at least January, February, D plus 50 days. Phase 2 consisted of the annexation of the Bismarck Archipelago, the capture of the entire Malaysian peninsula and the naval base in Singapore, the occupation of the South Burmese airfields, and moves into the Malacca Passage and Straits of Makassar in preparation for an invasion into the Netherlands East Indies. This phase was to be accomplished by D plus 100 days. The final portion was Phase 3, which included the capture of Sumatra and Java and the occupation of Burma, scheduled for completion of D 150, so 150 days past D Day. The operation in Malaya and Singapore then spanned portions of both Phase 1 and Phase 2. As it turned out, the Japanese took over 70 days to capture all of the Malayan Peninsula and Singapore, a full 30 days ahead of schedule. Another example of arranging operations was the Japanese decision to press their attack on Singapore rather than just shelling it. They had successfully occupied the entire Malayan Peninsula, moving a large distance in constant contact with the enemy in a relatively short period of time, and they could have taken the opportunity to rest their forces and simply shell Singapore into submission, but they did not. Instead, they decided to directly attack Singapore. The Japanese felt that the psychological impact of the rapid capitulation of the so-called impregnable fortress of Singapore on both their enemy and their own people would be significant. They also wanted to take possession of the British naval base as soon as possible, and thus ensure safe passage of their ships through the Singapore Straits. In addition, the troops involved in the Malaya-Singapore operation were solely needed for the ongoing campaigns in the Philippines and the Netherlands East Indies. The Japanese forces still had momentum, whereas the British and their allies had been in retreat and on the defensive for most of the campaign. Pressing the assault on Singapore thus exploited the Japanese strengths and weaknesses of their enemies. The essence of anticipation can be traced back to Sun Tzu. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the results of 100 battles. Japan's ultimate success in this campaign is directly attributable to its anticipation of the political and military requirements necessary to accomplish its strategic and operational objectives. They were keenly aware of their own strengths and weaknesses, and they worked hard to understand those of the British, which you see here. Strategically, they realized they could not win a war against a combination of all major powers that had important interests in the Far East. They had to find a way to eliminate the ability of one or more of these powers to join a war against them in the Pacific. They eliminated the Soviet Union from any coalition against them when Japanese Foreign Minister Soyoke Matsuoka negotiated a brilliant neutrality treaty with them in April 1941. That treaty ensured that the Japanese could focus on the southern region without worrying about the Soviets opening a second front against them in Manchuria or Korea. They also anticipated that the United States might join a coalition of colonial powers to defeat Japan in the Pacific. Therefore, the U.S. naval and naval-based air power in the Pacific were a vital threat to planned Japanese operations. Hence the Japanese attack on the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. At the operational level, joint doctrine addresses the element of anticipation by stating that understanding the types of capabilities and forces available to the opponent helps the joint force commander to focus objectives, phasing, and timing. The joint force commander uses intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets to form a picture of the enemy. The Japanese did a superb job of collecting information for a year prior to the Malaya campaign. The Japanese collected information concerning the British forces in Malaya, fortifications on the peninsula and Singapore, and the beachheads and terrain that would be encountered during the invasion. The Japanese collection assets included agents operating in Malaya, open source collection, and reconnaissance flights. To focus intelligence collection in preparation for the Malaya campaign, the Japanese created the Duo-Nawa unit, known as the Taiwan Army Research Section. The 30-member team was chartered to collect all conceivable data connected with tropical warfare in the 6 months before beginning the attack. The area of responsibility was the entire Pacific War region, and its budget was 20,000 yen, about 400 US. There's not a lot. The Dorinawa received open source information from the Southward Association, who had been collecting information about countries in the tropics to effect better trade. Information was also gained from sea captains, mining companies, banking officials, university professors, and private individuals. Open source collection, such as open source intelligence, what we call today OSINT, OSINT, open source intelligence, non-secret intelligence. Open source collection included a secret chart of Indonesia from a captain of a merchant ship who made many voyages through the South Pacific. In another example, the Japanese resident of Malaya gave Dorinawa aerial photos of Singapore. The Japanese also used a network of operatives. Up to the outbreak of hostilities, a significant number of Japanese nationals were permitted free movement in the country in accordance with the British policy of appeasing the Japanese government. Upon outbreak of hostilities, many of them disappeared before they could be interned, eventually returning with the invaders as guides and intelligence agents. In other instances, 2 members of Mawa, disguised as Thai locals, penetrated deep into Malaya and performed reconnaissance on areas of particular interest to the Japanese army. Valuable information was gained on airstrips, landing areas, Thai troop disembarkation points and defenses, and road systems. On another occasion, an officer from the military staff headquarters was entrusted with an official inspection of the southern areas of Malaya. He detailed critical information on Singapore defenses and British Army fighter planes and total troop strength. This first-hand information was essential to the Japanese High Command. During the planning phase, with all this information in hand, the Japanese conducted extensive terrain analysis, made templates of projected enemy force dispositions, and analyzed likely British actions. Much of this analysis was confirmed during secret aerial reconnaissance flights over the Malayan Peninsula. As a result, the Japanese were able to anticipate and accurately predict the defense of Malaya and Singapore. They were aware of the lack of British aircraft carrier support, and predicted predicted that the British would first secure the northern airfields in Malaya to support land-based aircraft. Therefore, the Japanese made the capture of these airfields their first priority, thereby denying their use to the British while retaining them for their own use. Thanks to their pre-war reconnaissance, the Japanese knew that the Malayan terrain and restrictive lines of communication favored the defender. So they developed and employed an innovative form of maneuver using successive amphibious operations, leapfrogging forces down the peninsula in a well, and they employed leapfrogging forces down the peninsula in a well-orchestrated and integrated naval ground force effort that allowed them to place forces to the flanks and rear of heavily prepared enemy defenses and major combat forces. Finally, the Japanese also currently anticipated the British main defensive plan of Singapore. This allowed them to successfully deceive the British defenders as to the direction of the Japanese main offensive. This map here shows the invasion of Malaya and Singapore between December 8th, 1941 and 15th February 1942, showing the dates when each town fell into Japanese hands. Thus, anticipation enhanced with the combined efforts of applied air, land, and naval power allowed the Japanese to accomplish preliminary actions that set the conditions for success and then operate well within the British decision cycle, consistently remaining one step ahead. Joint doctrine defines the concept of center of gravity as those characteristics, capabilities, or sources of power from which military force derives its freedom of action, physical strength, or will to fight. In theory, destruction or neutralization of an adversary's center of gravity is the most direct path to victory. A decisive point is a geographic place, specific key event, critical system, or function that allows commanders to gain a marked advantage over an enemy and greater influence the outcome of an attack. By applying leverage at and or to a decisive point, one's own COG can be protected and that of an adversary can be attacked. At the operational level of war, the Japanese brilliantly applied leverage and protected their own center of gravity while attacking those of the British. During the Malaya campaign, the Japanese operational COG was their naval forces. Since they were conducting operations in a maritime theater, their naval forces were crucial to their ability to project power ashore. Successful action against those forces, either directly or indirectly, would likely have deterred or terminated the Malayan campaign on terms of favorable to the British. The first significant operational decisive point occurred during the deployment of the Japanese Naval Expeditionary Force, embarked on two convoys from Hainan Island to the seaports of Singora and Kotobaru. The decisive point came when the Americans spotted these convoys 2 days before the Japanese landings, and they were reported by British aerial reconnaissance 1 day before. But no action was taken to interdict or preempt that embarked force while it was still extremely vulnerable. There were several reasons for this, but one of the most crucial had to do with Japanese awareness and concern regarding their COG. To protect the naval convoys, the lines of communication, and the deployment of forces ashore, the Japanese used their air and naval forces to gain air and naval superiority. They attacked the American fleet at Pearl Harbor and sank the British battlecruiser Repulse, and the new battleship Prince of Wales, and then destroyed most of the British air forces with bombing raids against British airfields in the region. Another of the Japanese decisive points was the Thai ports of Singapore and Patani, for it was through them and through the use of nearby airfields that the Japanese would have the means to successfully project their military power ashore, and then support and sustain it in the drive to Singapore. To deal with that contingency, the British had planned a preemptive strike to deny those ports to the Japanese. The plan, called Operation Matador, required a minimum of 24 hours warning of landing by Japanese forces, but the Japanese employed effective operations security, deceptive routing, and speed to protect the movements and intended destruction of their naval convoys. The result was that the Japanese were able to rapidly secure both ports, push their ground forces ashore, and begin their attacks down the Malayan Peninsula against the British Army before Operation Matador could be ordered into execution. For the British, the Army, a Commonwealth coalition primarily of British, Australian, and Indian units, was their operational COG. To deal with that army, the Japanese effectively applied their naval, ground, and air forces in a series of nose-to-nose clashes at key strong points that were supported by successful amphibious operations aimed at the flanks and rear of the defending British Army as they established sequential strongpoint defenses. This was to lead to an event that became the decisive point relative to the British COG, the Slim River Battle. It was there that the terrain gave the British the best advantage in terms of defense, but their defense was breached, and the fate of the British Army was sealed. When the Japanese broke through that position, central Malaya was lost to the British, and its largest city, Kuala Lumpur, was open to the enemy. The British defense of the peninsula rapidly deteriorated after the Slim River Battle. They were forced to fall back into the island of Singapore and prepare for their final defense, which ended with their surrender to the Japanese. The Japanese seizure of Singapore and the capture of thousands of prisoners were arguably the final operational decisive point of the campaign. Synergy and leverage are the foundation of joint warfare. They give a joint force commander the ability to achieve the greatest effect from all available forces and integrate and employ force to exploit advantages in combat power across all dimensions. In the Malaya campaign, the Japanese did a superb job integrating their air, land, and naval forces to overwhelm the British. There was superb cooperation between the land and naval forces and the air arms of both services. Whatever traditional jealousy might have existed between the Japanese Army and Navy did not extend to the armies and fleets at the front. The teamwork left nothing to be desired. Joint task forces organized during the summer of 1941 trained and worked together 12 continuously until the outbreak of hostilities. 4 years of frequent collaboration against an active enemy on the coasts and rivers of China had given both services much valuable experience, which was put to good use in planning and organizing joint expeditionary forces. Details of command, supply, and other matters were carefully worked out in advance and clearly understood by all concerned. Specific examples of Japanese synergy and leverage during the Malaya campaign include the landings of Koto Baru, the attack on Parit Buntar, and the assault down the Malaya Peninsula. During the landings of the Kota Baru, all forces were in total cooperation. The initial beach assault began at night, which deprived the Japanese of close air support. At daybreak, Japanese aircraft attacked British air bases, conducted close air support of the attack, and established almost uninterrupted air superiority over the operating area. Once air superiority was gained, the Japanese had their reconnaissance planes and dive bombers to strafe British ground troops and supply columns while using their heavy bombers for long-range attacks on bridges and other objectives. The attack on Parit Buntar and assault down the Malay Peninsula went just as smoothly. The roads in which the troops marched were low, flat country covered with dense jungle. The density of the jungle was such that it was impossible to move more than a few feet off the road on either side. The fighting was done by small units at the head of the column in spite of the large number of troops available. By the clever use of demolitions, roadblocks, and rear guards armed with motorized anti-tank guns, the British were able to slow the Japanese advance and inflict heavy losses. But the Japanese soon realized the fighting in this area was similar to the mountain pass fighting encountered by the Germans in Norway and the Balkans. Using German tactics, the Japanese used dive bombers as a kind of long-range artillery where the terrain made observation difficult and the emplacement of large numbers of artillery batteries virtually impossible. Roadblocks and centers of resistance were cleared with a few bombs from dive bombers. The Japanese proceeded in this way down the peninsula, a series of direct frontal attacks against each strongpoint in turn, supported by a series of amphibious maneuvers that placed forces to the flanks and rear of these strongpoints. This integrated approach compelled the British defenders to rapidly withdraw and establish defensive lines further and further to the rear, and closer to Singapore. The objective each time was limited to the strongpoint immediately in front, and after its capture, fresh combat teams were brought up to defend the area against counterattacks by the British. Thus, the synergy and leverage of air, land, and sea forces allowed the Japanese to gain, maintain, and exploit the advantage against an enemy defending in a subtropical jungle. Within and upon terrain thought by the British as to be impassable. Operational reach and approach. Operational reach is the ability to support operations over some distance. By understanding operational reach, the Joint Force Commander can establish the operational approach lines of operations and sequencing operations for the given campaign. The Japanese clearly understood the operational reach of their forces. Limited sea-based aircraft and poor road and rail networks in Malaya bounded the areas for invasion and the sequence of operations. The Japanese chose to land invasion forces at Singora and Patani in Malaya and create Isthmus and Cote Baru in Thailand. These beachheads were chosen because they had sustainable terrain for landing forces, significant road networks, and local air bases, and were within the range of land-based air cover. Singora and Cote Baru were also on branch lines of the Singapore-Bangkok Railway. During the initial stages of the campaign, Japanese aircraft operated from bases in southern Indochina to provide air cover for the invasion forces. Naval planes provided air cover for the invasion convoys. Success hinged on the early seizure of the local air bases in order to enable land-based air power to move forward and thus have the reach to cover troop advances. The invasion forces moved west, then south. That movement allowed the primary Japanese ground effort to use existing rail and road networks. The southern advance was thus protected by sea power and air power from air bases seized during the advance. Reinforcements were brought in from Bangkok using the existing Singapore-Bangkok Railway. Reinforcements could also be brought in from from sea if necessary. Land-based air power moved down the peninsula as air bases were seized, thus maintaining continuous air support. The Japanese also advanced along rail and road networks to allow for easier force replenishment. Had the Japanese not sequenced their attack in that fashion, British forces would have overwhelmed them. And you can see down here in this line, um, this here is where Commonwealth forces in Singapore had surrendered. It was right here in the bottom, and that's on February, and they had, of course, taken, and then of course they had taken. They've got Sumatra. They're going to have Sumatra. They're going to have so Malaya, and of course, with the loss of the one battle cruiser, one battleship, the Repulse and the Prince of Wales. It's another major hit. So the British surrender at the bottom of the island here at Lahore Baru, February 15th, 1942. Joint Force commanders should strive to achieve simultaneity and depth in their application of operational art. The goal is to bring the appropriate elements of the force to bear simultaneously against the opponent's entire structure to the depth of the theater in order to multiply the combined effects and increase synergy of the attacking force. The initial Japanese landings in Thailand and Malaya, accompanied by air attacks against British air bases in Malaya, are some of the best examples of the Japanese use of simultaneity and depth in the campaign. The Japanese landed ground forces in the areas we talked about in first at Kota Baru in Malaya and met some resistance at Kota Baru. The landings at Singora and Patani were virtually unopposed. In conjunction with the landings, a series of air attacks were conducted against British airfields in northern Malaya. These air attacks succeeded in destroying the majority of the British aircraft, and within 24 hours of the beginning of the operation, air superiority had been attained, and the RAF in Malaya no longer existed as an effective fighting force. The very next day, the British ships Prince of Wales and Repulse were sighted by a Japanese submarine. The ships had no air cover due to the destruction of the RAF in Malaya, and the Japanese launched an air attack against the ships. Well, this attack was unsuccessful. Another sighting the next day, and a determined air attack with a larger force led to the destruction of the two British ships. Within a matter of 2 days, the Japanese were masters of both air and sea. The Japanese achieved this feat by their simultaneous use of their air, land, and naval forces throughout the depth of the area of operations. The British forces, on the other hand, employed their forces either independently or without effective coordination, and did not achieve simultaneity or depth. Another example of the Japanese use of balance was their technique of rotating battalions through the fight. Since the terrain would often permit only a single battalion to be in contact with the enemy, the Japanese would continually rotate their battalions, resting the bulk of their forces and keeping fresh troops at the front. That technique was very effective in both the fight for the Lower Hills and in the Battle of Kuala Lumpur. In the Lower Hills, the defenders consisted of a single battalion, which quickly tired under the assault of fresh Japanese troops. In Kuala Lumpur, although the British forces had troops in reserve, they were unable to bring them to the front in time. Timing and tempo joint force commanders should carry out operations at a time with a tempo that best inhibits the enemy and exploits friendly capabilities. Proper timing allows the Joint Force Commander to control the action, staying in unpredictable to his opponent and to operate more rapidly than the enemy can react. One of the best examples of the use of timing and tempo was the initial Japanese attack on Malaya. The attack was so swift and well concealed that the initial landings in Thailand and northern Malaya were conducted before the British had time to give the execute order for Operation Matador. Within a few hours of the start of hostilities, the Japanese had over 26,000 men ashore. Another example of the Japanese use of timing and tempo took place during the Battle of Kuala Lumpur. The British had realized that the Japanese units landing behind their lines were the most severe threat to their continued defense of the Malaya Peninsula, and sent a force to the mouth of the Selangor River to block the most logical landing place for Japanese forces. However, the strength of the Japanese attack on the British front required so many troops in defense that the British were unable to mount an adequate defense at the mouth of the Selangor. The British were able to prevent the Japanese from landing for a time with air attacks from a recently reinforced RAF, but this too was soon squashed, and the Japanese landed at the Selangor. Culmination is the physical or physiological point at which a military force no longer has the capability to continue its form of operations, offense or defense. It is usually directly attributable to a physical constraint like logistics or adequate available combat forces, but on occasion can be attributed to vital, intangible factors such as morale or the will to fight. In the Malaya campaign, the Japanese expertly applied or exploited nearly all the fundamental elements of operational art. However, with regard to the concept of culmination, they were less artful. In fact, by several accounts, they almost culminated too soon, at a point before the seizure of Singapore, the primary objective of the Malayan campaign. Without Singapore, the campaign would have been a failure. What created the conditions for culmination was having too many irons in the fire. The Japanese planned to execute 5 separate, simultaneous major operations, while continuing operations in China and sustaining the occupation of Manchuria and Korea. Rather than adopt a strategy of sequential operations, which would have allowed for the employment of numerous numerically superior forces, they instead conducted simultaneous operations that depended on speed of execution. The Japanese planned quick strikes with the intent that all operations would be successfully concluded before British reinforcements could be deployed. This was crucial because a defeat in any one operation could have caused a cascading problem requiring diversion of forces from one operation to another. Based on the strategy of speed, the Japanese began the Malaya campaign with fewer ground forces than the British. That was a risk, but they had the tempo and the speed and the surprise. They did all that right. The campaign ended with Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, the commanding general of British forces, surrendered more than 130,000 British, Indian, Australian, and local volunteer troops to a Japanese force of half their number. It could be argued that the Japanese were nearing culmination when Percival surrendered. The historian Lewis Allen writes that Japanese Lieutenant General Yamashita, commander of the 25th Army, believed that his own offensive had run out at the time when the British signaled their surrender. Several accounts indicate that the Japanese were running out of ammunition. The men were physically exhausted, and they had no more reserves to commit to the offensive. General Wavell, Archibald Wavell, the commander of the American, British, Dutch, Australian Command, which had assumed command of the Greater, believed the Japanese could be fought to a standstill, held, and then driven back. Important questions remain unanswered concerning either side's ability to continue the campaign at the point of surrender. Had the Japanese offensive culminated, or was it nearing culmination? Could the sizable surviving British and indigenous forces have mounted a defense of the city of Singapore that might have either brought the Japanese offensive to an operational culmination or delayed a British defeat until follow-on forces could arrive or a diplomatic solution be found? It can never be known for certain, but some believe that there was a real possibility the British could have mounted a successful defense of the city of Singapore, brought the Japanese offensive to a culmination, ejected the Japanese from the island, and prevented the capture of Singapore. Nevertheless, with their surrender, it is clear that culmination, at least in terms of the will to fight, occurred with the British first, and with the Japanese having demonstrated their ability to bring all of their forces to bear, air, land, and naval, may well have presented the British, who were contending the battle with ground forces, only with a situation that appeared hopeless. While the Japanese clearly used the principle of joint warfare more skillfully than their adversaries, there were additional factors that contributed to the success of the operation. One of those factors was the morale of the Japanese troops. There is no questioning the extreme nationalistic fervor and high motivation of the Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen. That exceptional offensive spirit was recognized both by the Japanese and by their enemies. In addition, following the economic and oil embargo imposed by the Allies, the Japanese were convinced they were fighting for the survival of their nation. That fact, coupled with their culture, at the heart of which was the emperor, gave the Japanese people a powerful national will to fight. Consider that the Japanese homeland endured intense attacks, including atomic bombings that killed tens of thousands, for over 3 years. Yet the nation's will to fight was never broken. Despite the fact that the Japanese were being slowly ground down and driven back toward Japan, the Allies were still likely facing a fierce defense of the Japanese homeland. The defeat of Japan did not come until Emperor Hirohito publicly announced his government had decided to treat with the enemy. Then 70 million subjects relapsed instantly into the posture of defeat. Another major factor in the success of the Japanese campaign was training, specifically that which was oriented toward joint operations. This manifested itself in a number of different areas. One of these was the way the Japanese air cadets were trained. An air cadet course was established at the Japanese Military Academy in 1926, and while air cadets received additional instruction related to their specialty, they lived among the ground cadets and received the same education. When the Military Air Academy was established in 1937, air cadets were chosen from junior cadets who already had 2 years of training at the Military Academy. So air officers had a good knowledge of Army tactics. To further strengthen ties between the two services, artillery and infantry officers were selected each year for liaison duty with the Air Force. and they received reconnaissance training. The Japanese also established air-ground communication squads in each headquarters, usually led by signal officers who had received training in air-ground communications. When an air-ground action was planned, various tactical details were worked out, including procedures for air-ground communications, ensuring that the two forces were closely coordinated. Yet another example of the joint training was the use of two full-scale joint rehearsals. The first of those took place in March 1941 and involved large-scale Navy and Army maneuvers, simulating an attack on Singapore following an amphibious landing in Malaya. The 5th Division Army, escorted by combined fleet elements and with cover from Army air units, crossed the East China Sea while under simulated attack from air and naval units, made a landing on Kyushu and simulated the capture of coastal defenses. That very successful exercise focused on development of anti-submarine and anti-aircraft defense of convoys, the tactical challenges of uh, amphibious landings, and rapid construction of airstrips in newly occupied areas. The commander of the exercise later became Yamashita's chief of staff in Malaya. The second exercise took place in southern China in June 41. Officers and men sweated under the hot sun for 10 days while testing tactical and logistical advances from the Army Research Section. The exercise culminated in the amphibious landing of the reinforced infantry battalion on Hainan Island in China. The island's circumference, over 600 miles, roughly approximated the distance from the planned landing sites in Thailand to Singapore, and the assault force made its way around the island to simulate an attack on the British base at Singapore. The troops made training attacks, practiced destroying and repairing bridges, and exercised their useful skills. Because of that, the Japanese learned a great deal about equipment, tactics, organization for warfare in the tropics. In conclusion, the Japanese success during the Malaya campaign, like any success, can be attributed to a number of factors. It could be argued that the political decisions on the part of the British with respect to theater priorities and force allocations prevented the British in Malaya from being better supported by their air and naval forces. It could be argued that there were issues of leadership and unity of command, issues of training and morale, and that elements of luck played a part. Certainly these were all factors, as no doubt there were others, but it doesn't change the fact that the Japanese conducted a joint warfighting campaign as it would be defined in today's terms. And it was that aspect of their operations that were crucial to their success in Malaya, irrespective of other factors. The Japanese demonstrated that operational art is just that, art. After that, they obviously did not know that they were adhering to the tenets of current joint doctrine, that they were applying the fundamental elements of operational art as they are formalized today. Yet apply them they did. They managed to bring those fundamentals together into the framework of a campaign in which they merged the unique capabilities offered by their air, land, and naval forces. So you can see the invasion of Malaya. The main objective is Singapore, and it follows with the fall of Singapore, which is from basically the 8th to the 15th of February 1942, and that resulted in the Japanese victory. And the British, this actually resulted in the capture of Singapore and the largest British surrender in its history. And so that is, of course, you have to look at the strength Some reports anywhere the British had 85,000, and some reports are 130,000. But they had more tanks, they had more AFVs, um, 54 Fortress guns, um, and they had over 80,000 wounded and captured. The British did. Um, the Japanese losses were 1,714 killed, 3,378 wounded, according to this report, and their troops were 36,000 in total, which is amazing. They just used the timing and the culmination just brilliantly of the culmination of force just brilliantly. Um, so I mean, it's we'll talk about more in the next presentation about the fall of Singapore a bit more, and then so if you can imagine, it's a lot. I mean, 5,000 British killed, 80,000 wounded and captured. That's a lot. The largest um, British captured in the Second World War. So that's saying something definitely. Their approach, the Japanese approach was multidimensional, an approach that they had trained for and then executed with great effort. Their success was unified action. They supported ground and naval operations with integrated deep and close air support. They integrated their naval and air power into the projection of ground forces ashore and the maneuver of those forces down the peninsula. The result was the achievement of a level of synergy that allowed an outnumbered attacking force to defeat a much larger defending force, defending on ground of its choosing. The multidimensional aspect of their campaign gave the Japanese the means to attack in depth across the theater, eliminating British air and naval threats, achieving theater-wide air and naval superiority, and projecting ground power ashore. Through that attack in depth, the Japanese created a set of conditions in which actions had the effect of simultaneity in an effect that was manifested by the fact that British naval and air support was of no relevance at the time when it would have been needed most during the Japanese entry onto and their drive down the Malaya Peninsula. Simultaneity and actions in depth achieved by the synergy of multidimensional attack ultimately denied the British the capability of challenging the Japanese in more than one dimension. That allowed the Japanese to reach their ultimate objective, Singapore, indirectly attacking down a peninsula against an enemy compelled to defend it with ground forces alone. One historian expressed the situation this way: apart from the Japanese preponderance in aircraft carriers, the Allied fleets and the Japanese fleet had been roughly equally matched when hostilities began. By the afternoon of the 10th December 1941, the Japanese fleet was the mistress of the seas from Hawaii to Ceylon. The British army in Malaya was on its own. And so in the final analysis, the Japanese managed to create for themselves an operational level isometric advantage. They shaped the British into a one-dimensional adversary, forced to defend a peninsula against a multi-dimensional onslaught. Thus, the Japanese succeeded in Malaya because they applied the tenets of joint warfighting doctrine. They were able to conduct an effective multidimensional joint warfighting campaign against a one-dimensional enemy who was not. So, and this comes from U.S. One of the U.S. military academies, and I wanted to share this. This is a really great overview of the Malaya campaign in Singapore, and it just hammers down the fact that the British were not ready, and the Japanese were, even with a smaller force, had so much synergy and capability and simultaneity. I mean, it's incredible the way they are able to attack. I mean, so um, All right, I will do one quick presentation on the fall of Singapore sometime soon. And all right, next presentations on the World War II timelines are coming up, and as well as World War I timelines. I'm Aaron Bulma, military specialist for Carlton County. Thank you.